In 1873, the world was experiencing a pandemic like it is now. It was a cholera pandemic. It came to Nashville in May of 1873. Some inmates at the penitentiary were sent to work on the Memphis-Paducah Railway line in West Tennessee. When they returned, they brought cholera with them. They infected some inmates, infected some workers, and eventually the town was infected. It spread throughout the whole city. 1 out of every 25 Nashvillians died in that epidemic from May to middle of July. And one of the interesting things about the experience of that pandemic is something that's very similar to what's happening now with the coronavirus in the United States. See, in Nashville, African Americans made up 37% of the population, but 62% of the deaths in Nashville were African American. That no doubt relates to poverty, crowded conditions, but it also relates to how African Americans are treated. You see, in Nashville, a lot of the wealthy people were able to leave town. They were able to escape the epidemic. But African Americans were too impoverished to escape, so they had to endure. David Lipscomb, the editor of the Gospel Advocate, is one of those who points this out in some ways. He chides Christians who left town in order to escape, and he called them to actually minister in town and to be a part of the solution rather than running away from the problem. He was the editor of the Gospel Advocate here in Nashville, and he lived 10 miles outside of town, but he stayed in Nashville in order to minister to the poor, particularly the African American. He used his resources, from his buggy to take nuns around to different houses and to care for the poor. He used his wealth, he used his time, his energy, his hands and his feet, and he went into the homes of African Americans and bathed them and fed them and nursed them, along with others. In fact, every minister in town stayed in town except for one. But Christians, some Christians, fled. And Lipscomb thought that that was a horrible witness to the gospel. Because when the sick and the poor are among us, Jesus ministers to them. And we need to learn to be Jesus to those who are at risk. Lipscomb tells the story how soon after the epidemic, he ran into a friend on the street and they began to talk, and they were talking about this recent book by Buckner H. Payne, who went by the pseudonym of Ariel. It was a book on, quote, the Negro, what is his ethnological status. And Payne, who was a resident of Nashville, in fact died in an asylum in Nashville eventually, Payne argued that African Americans had no soul. That in fact they are descendants from animals that made it onto the ark. His book, Payne's book, has been used by white supremacists for ages. And Lipscomb had a conversation with a friend about Mr. Payne on the streets of Nashville. And in his conversation, he reflected on his experience, or drew on his experience, with African Americans in their homes. He thought that if he could have Mr. Payne for 1 week, just for 1 week, and Mr. Payne could go with him to minister to African Americans in their home and to care for them in their sickness and to be with them in their deaths, that he would learn that African Americans have a soul. See, Lipscomb believed that by feeding and nursing starving, sick, and dying African Americans, that whoever does that, whoever does that act of kindness or mercy would feel the kindling sparks of love grow within their hearts, and they would learn to love their neighbor. Maybe this is the time during the coronavirus that we need to learn to love our neighbors. Maybe it's a time that we need to learn some lessons about epidemics and about how certain populations are more affected than others. Maybe we need to think about what potential reasons might account for that. But what we learned from David Lipscomb and from other ministers in Nashville during the cholera epidemic is that if we're going to be Jesus to people, we need to minister to them, even at our own risk. Not in a reckless way, but in a way that serves and helps and loves our neighbor.